Once upon a time, there was a woman with a heart of ice whose cruelty knew no bounds. In an act of pure malice, she beat her own elderly mother until the frail lady fainted, lying inert on the cold floor. But fate, or perhaps nature itself, had other plans for that dark night. It was then that from the shadows a rare and majestic sight emerged, an albino tiger. Far from being a threat, the beast approached the elderly woman with surprising delicacy, using its snout to gently awaken her, a tender gesture that brutally contrasted with the violence she had just suffered. The villainess, who watched the scene with disdain, tried to flee in her car, but the albino tiger, with a protective fury, charged at the vehicle. The impact was devastating, causing the wicked woman to lose control, crash violently into the wall, and break her leg amidst the wreckage. Her escape was thwarted, and justice finally caught up with her, taking her to jail, where she would pay for her cruelty. The air still vibrated with the distorted echo of the collision, a sound that tore through the night's quiet and spread like an omen. The red and blue lights of police cars and ambulances already danced frantically over the wreckage of the villainess's car, a tangle of twisted metal against the cracked wall. The wicked woman, now just a handcuffed figure contorted in pain, had already been taken away, her leg broken and her fate sealed, at least for now. But at the center of that scene of chaos lay the true victim, the elderly mother, who slowly began to emerge from the fog of her own pain and confusion. When paramedics and police finally found her, huddled on the cold floor of the room, the image was desolate. Her eyes, once filled with terror and resignation, now carried a glimmer of something more, an almost dreamlike memory of an unexpected warmth, of a gentle touch that had pulled her back from the abyss. She couldn't articulate the words, but the sensation of the tiger's soft snout, the warm breath on her aged skin, remained like a balm on her wounded soul. Carefully, the rescuers lifted her, assessing the bruises and swellings that marked her fragile body, silent testimonies to her own daughter's brutality. As the elderly woman was taken to the ambulance, the rescue team swept the surroundings, not only in search of more victims, but also, almost incredulously, looking for any trace of the creature that, according to some astonished neighbors, had been seen, an albino tiger. The idea was absurd, a collective delusion. But the impact on the car and the protective fury described by a witness who peeked through the window were undeniable. However, the majestic beast had disappeared as mysteriously as it appeared, dissolving into the shadows of the night, leaving behind only the legend of an improbable guardian, a spirit of nature that manifested to correct an injustice. Far from there, in the cold, impersonal corridors of the police station, the villainess faced a very different reality. The searing pain in her broken leg was just the beginning. Each beat of her heart seemed to echo the loss of her freedom, the fall of her small empire of cruelty. Sitting in a wheelchair, her expression was a mixture of contained fury and disbelief. How could this have happened? How dared a wild animal, a mere tiger, challenge her, remove her from her path, from her life of control and domination? The humiliation was almost as unbearable as the physical pain. The registration process was mechanical, depersonalized. Her fingerprints, her photo, the questions she refused to answer, responding only with a silence charged with contempt. A prison doctor bandaged her leg, the rough manipulation adding insult to injury. She was no longer the woman who dictated rules, but a prisoner, stripped of her power and dignity. The smell of disinfectant and despair permeated the air, and every sound, the jingle of keys, the echo of distant footsteps, reinforced the invisible bars that now separated her from the world she knew. Meanwhile, the elderly mother was admitted to a hospital. The doctors and nurses, with their soft voices and gentle touches, were a stark contrast to the brutality she had endured. She was physically hurt, But the tiger's warmth, the feeling of being protected, had left a deeper mark, a seed of hope and resilience. News of the incident spread quickly through the small community, and a wave of solidarity and indignation swept over the neighbors. Flowers, cards, and messages of support began to arrive, a reminder that despite the darkness, there was still goodness in the world. For the villainess, however, there were no flowers, only the grey walls of her cell. The charges were heavy: assault, elder abuse, attempted escape. The prosecutor was already building the case, and the story of the albino tiger, however fantastic it seemed, only served to paint an even darker picture of her depravity. She felt no remorse, only bitter resentment, a thirst for revenge against the world that dared to turn its back on her. But for now, her only company was the throbbing pain in her leg and the echo of her own dark thoughts. The night advanced, and while the elderly mother, under the care of compassionate strangers, began her long journey of healing, the villainess in her cold cell began her own journey, a descent into the abyss of her choices, where freedom and power were only distant memories. The albino tiger, the true catalyst of justice, had fulfilled its role and retreated, leaving behind a trail of mystery and an uncertain future for all involved. The chapter of her cruelty had ended, but the story of its consequences was only beginning to unfold. The night, which had previously dragged on with the weight of darkness and violence, now gave way to a cold and relentless dawn. For the villainess, every minute was an eternity of torment, not from remorse, but from fury. The cell, a cube of concrete and bars, was an insult to her existence, a constant reminder of her impotence. The smell of disinfectant mingled with the metallic odor of her own dried blood and the stench of despair that seemed to impregnate the walls. Her leg, immobilized by a makeshift splint and carelessly bandaged, throbbed with excruciating pain, but it was the pain in her soul that consumed her. She refused to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of the albino tiger, with its immaculate fur and penetrating eyes, appeared in her mind, a specter of her humiliation. How dared an animal, a mere beast, challenge her? The question echoed in her mind, fueling a visceral hatred. She, who had always controlled, who had always dominated, was now at the mercy of a system she despised, and a creature that seemed to have emerged from hell to bring her down. The silence of the cell was broken only by the distant jingle of keys and the muffled groans of other prisoners. She watched the small barred window where a piece of the dark sky began to lighten, announcing a new day, a day of shame and confinement. But in her sick mind, there was no room for resignation. There were only plans, plans of escape, plans of revenge. She was not a victim. She was a predator temporarily caged. They would pay, all of them. The old woman, the police, the prosecutor, and especially that damned tiger. The idea that her own mother could have found such an improbable protector only served to further ignite her rage. Meanwhile, a few kilometers away, in a hospital room bathed in the soft light of dawn, the elderly mother began to awaken to a very different reality. Her eyes, once blurred by pain and fear, now reflected an unexpected calm. Her body still ached, each bruise a reminder of the brutality suffered, but her soul seemed lighter. The tiger's touch, that warm, soft breath on her aged skin, was no longer a dreamlike memory, but a comforting certainty. It was as if the animal had taken away a part of the terror and left behind a seed of peace. A nurse entered, smiling gently. "Good morning, madam. How do you feel?" The voice was soft, a balm to the elderly woman's ears. Accustomed to screams and harsh words, she tried to respond, but the words still refused to come out. Her throat was scratchy, and exhaustion was still profound. However, a small smile, fragile as a newborn flower, curved her lips. The nurse understood. She gently touched her hand, checking vital signs, changing the cold compresses. That care, that humanity, was a stark contrast to the loneliness and abandonment she had known for so long. News of the albino tiger had spread like wildfire, becoming a legend even before the sun had fully risen. In the hospital corridors, whispers were constant. Did you hear about the tiger? A wild animal, protecting an elderly woman. The story, however fantastic it seemed, was a ray of hope amidst the darkness of human cruelty. For the elderly woman, this legend was her truth. She knew she wasn't crazy, that she hadn't dreamed. The tiger existed, and it saved her. This conviction in itself was a powerful analgesic for her soul. Hours dragged on. At the police station, the villainess was interrogated again. Her attitude was defiant, her eyes flashing with contempt. "I have nothing to say," she repeated, her voice hoarse with contained rage. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with a tired but determined look, watched her through the interrogation room glass. He had seen everything, but the coldness of that woman, the total absence of remorse, was disturbing. The case was solid, the evidence, the testimonies, and the icing on the cake. The tiger's story, which, though bizarre, gave an almost mythical touch to the accused's depravity. As the villainess was transferred to a provisional detention cell, where she would await her custody hearing, the elderly woman received a visit from a social worker. The woman, with a gentle demeanor, explained the next steps. Recovery, the search for a new safe home, perhaps in a long-term care facility or with distant relatives who had already been contacted. The elderly woman listened, absorbing every word. The future, which once seemed a dark abyss, now opened with possibilities, however uncertain. The idea of a new beginning, away from her daughter's shadow, was a relief she didn't know she needed. The villainess, in turn, felt the weight of the bars closing in on her. The reality of her situation began to solidify. There was no longer a driver, no longer servants, no longer the luxury of her home. There was only the grey uniform, the bland food, and the unwanted company of other women who, like her, had crossed the line of the law. But even there, in prison, her mind didn't stop. She began to observe, to analyze, to weave the web of her next move. Her broken leg was an impediment, but her mind, sharp and cruel, remained intact. Justice had reached her, yes, but the battle was far from over. In fact, for the villainess, it was just beginning. The cold and relentless dawn gave way to a grey and oppressive day within the prison walls. For the villainess, every ray of light that dared to penetrate the small barred window of her provisional cell was an insult, a cruel reminder of a world she had lost and which, in her distorted mind, had conspired against her. The pain in her broken leg was a constant, a pulsating hammer that echoed with every beat of her heart, but the sharpest pain was that of humiliation. She, who had always dictated the rules, was now subject to them, stripped of her authority, her fortune, her very identity. The social worker explained that there was a vacancy in a highly respected nursing home, far from the city, in a rural and peaceful environment. "It would be a safe place, madam, where you would receive all the care and affection you deserve." The idea of a new beginning, away from her daughter's shadow, was almost unbelievable. The future, which once seemed a dark abyss, now opened with the promise of peace and security. The image of the albino tiger, the unexpected guardian, floated in her mind, a constant reminder that, even in the deepest darkness, light can emerge from where it is least expected. He had appeared, fulfilled his role, and retreated, leaving behind not only a legend, but a new chance at life for her. On the morning of the hearing, the villainess's cell was opened with a metallic creak. 2 guards awaited her, their faces impassive. She stood with difficulty, leaning against the wall, her leg in a cast, making every movement a torture. But she did not allow the pain to show on her face. Her eyes, icy and calculating, swept the room, absorbing every detail. She was not a victim. She was a strategist. As she was led out of the police station, the flash of cameras blinded her for an instant. Reporters shouted questions, microphones were extended towards her, and the crowd of onlookers gathered behind the security barriers. The story of the albino tiger had spread like wildfire, turning her case into a media spectacle. She felt a thrill of satisfaction. Attention, even negative, was a power she knew how to manipulate. In court, the atmosphere was charged with tension. The prosecutor, with his firm posture and resonant voice, presented the evidence forcefully. The neighbors' testimonies, photos of the elderly mother, the medical report detailing the assaults, the forensic evidence from the car accident. He painted a grim picture of the villainess's cruelty, emphasizing the victim's vulnerability and the heinous nature of the crime. The defense attorney, visibly uncomfortable with the hostility of the public and her client's lack of cooperation, tried to argue for the presumption of innocence and the need for medical treatment for the villainess's leg, suggesting house arrest. The villainess, seated at the defense table, with her leg extended and a semblance of forced pain, watched the spectacle with almost palpable disdain. She denied everything, with a coldness that shocked even the most experienced observers. Her voice, when questioned by the judge, was low and controlled, tinged with a false fragility. She tried to present herself as the true victim, a woman unjustly accused, the target of a conspiracy. But her eyes, which could not hide the flame of her hatred, betrayed the farce. The judge, a man with a serious demeanor and a grave voice, listened attentively. He considered the evidence, the gravity of the charges, and the risk of flight. Given the seriousness of the charges, the vulnerability of the victim, and the risk of recidivism and flight, this court denies the request for bail, he declared, his voice echoing in the room. The accused will remain detained until trial. The decision was met with a murmur of approval in the courtroom and a sigh of relief from the social worker, who was closely following the case. For the villainess, however, the news was a blow, but she did not allow herself to react. Her face remained expressionless, her eyes fixed on the judge. Inside, however, fury seethed, transforming into an even more elaborate plan. They thought they had imprisoned her. How naive. The cell was just a new chessboard, and she, the fallen queen, was about to initiate a checkmate no one expected. The legal battle had just begun, and she was more determined than ever to win. Justice for her was merely an obstacle to be overcome. The judge's decision echoed in the room, but for the villainess, it was just another noise in the whirlwind of her mind. Denial of bail, remain detained, words that for anyone else would mean defeat. For her, they were merely the prelude to a new act. Her icy eyes, fixed on the magistrate's grave face, did not betray the fury simmering within her. The facade of fragility, carefully constructed for the hearing, crumbled in silence, replaced by an iron determination. They thought they had cornered her. How foolish. The cell was not a prison, it was a new chessboard, and she, the fallen queen, was about to initiate a checkmate no one expected. Back in her cell, the silence was a canvas for her thoughts. Her leg in a cast, a constant reminder of her fall, throbbed with pain. But the physical pain was insignificant compared to the wound to her pride. The albino tiger. He was the pivot, the turning point, the aberration that had dared to challenge her. And for that, he would be first on her list of revenge. But first, she needed to free herself from the chains that bound her. She observed the other inmates, their interactions, their weaknesses, their fears, the informal hierarchy, the tacit alliances, the unwritten codes. She noted the guards, their shifts, their routines, the small lapses in attention, the creaking doors, the flickering cameras. Her mind, a labyrinth of cruelty and cunning, processed every detail, building a mental map of this new environment. The cell was small, but the world in her head was vast and full of dark possibilities. The state-appointed attorney returned, bringing with her the case paperwork. The villainess greeted her with a cold smile, a mask of cooperation that barely concealed her contempt. "Tell me, Doctor." Her voice was a calculating whisper. "What is your success rate in cases like mine?" The attorney, accustomed to arrogance, responded professionally, but the villainess had already caught the hesitation, the lack of confidence. She didn't need an attorney, she needed a tool. And this woman, with her inexperience and tired idealism, could be molded to serve her purposes. While the villainess wove her webs of manipulation, a few kilometers away, the morning sun caressed the elderly mother's aged face. She had slept, a deep, restorative sleep, the first in many years that had not been disturbed by fear or pain. Upon waking, she felt a lightness in her chest, as if an invisible weight had been removed. The nurse, the same one from the day before, entered with a gentle smile, bringing a cup of chamomile tea. "Good morning, madam. Did you sleep well?" The voice was a balm. The elderly woman nodded, a small smile curving her lips. Her throat still hurt, but a faint whisper managed to escape. "Yes, thank you." Each sip of tea was a small step on her healing journey, each gentle touch, a reminder that kindness still existed. The social worker and Maria, the volunteer, returned, bringing not only flowers, but the promise of a future. "Madame, the nursing home has confirmed the vacancy," said the social worker, her voice full of hope. "It's a beautiful place in the countryside, with gardens and much peace." The elderly woman looked at Maria, who held her hand gently. The idea of a new beginning away from her daughter's shadow was almost unbelievable. The future, which once seemed a dark abyss, now opened with the promise of peace and security. She remembered the albino tiger, the unexpected guardian. Its image floated in her mind, a constant reminder that even in the deepest darkness, light can emerge from where it is least expected. He had appeared, fulfilled his role, and retreated, leaving behind not only a legend but a new chance at life for her. She couldn't speak much, but her eyes conveyed deep gratitude. A nod of her head, a squeeze of Maria's hand, and a small but sincere yes. It was the acceptance of a new chapter, the renunciation of a past of pain. The custody hearing had been only the first skirmish. The main trial was approaching, and with it, the opportunity to test the waters, to sow doubt, to begin to dismantle the web that bound her. Her lips curved into an almost imperceptible smile, a smile that did not reach her icy eyes. The world outside thought she was defeated. How foolish. She was merely regrouping. Every day in prison was a lesson, every interaction, an opportunity to gather information. She had already identified an inmate, an older, cynical woman, who seemed to have a deep knowledge of the inner workings of that place. A possible ally, or perhaps a piece to be moved in her own game. The legal battle had only just begun, and she was more determined than ever to win. Justice, for her, was merely an obstacle to be overcome, and she was already drawing the paths to circumvent it. The cell, for the villainess, was not an end, but a new beginning. The steel bars were merely a temporary backdrop for the play she was about to stage. Her leg in a cast, a constant reminder of her fall, throbbed with pain, but the physical pain was insignificant compared to the wound to her pride. The albino tiger. That animal was the pivot, the turning point, the aberration that had dared to challenge her. And for that, he would be first on her list of revenge. But first, she needed to free herself from the chains that bound her. And for that, every person in her path would be a piece on her chessboard. Her attorney, the young and idealistic attorney Lucia, returned the next day, bringing with her a pile of documents and a worried expression. The villainess greeted her with a smile that did not reach her eyes, a mask of cooperation that barely concealed her contempt. "Doctor?" Her voice was a calculating whisper, tinged with a false fragility. "I'm so confused. All of this is a nightmare. I just wanted to take care of my mother, and now I'm here." She gestured with her free hand at the austere surroundings, a gesture that seemed to plead for understanding. Lucia, though hardened by the bureaucracy of the system, still carried a remnant of belief in human goodness. The villainess noticed the hesitation, the thinly veiled compassion in the attorney's eyes. It was the opening she needed. "I know the evidence seems against me," the villainess continued, her voice almost inaudible. "But there's something no one knows. My mother, she has delusions, she fantasizes things. I was trying to protect her from herself, from her own inventions. It's a terrible illness." The attorney frowned, absorbing the information. The villainess observed, satisfied. She didn't need Lucia to believe her completely, only for the seed of doubt to be planted. "We need a psychiatric report for her, doctor, to prove what I'm saying. And perhaps I myself need help. The stress of all this, my broken leg. I'm on the verge of a breakdown." Jean, the villainess, knew that the suggestion of her own fragility, even if feigned, could open doors for external medical evaluations, perhaps even for a transfer to a prison hospital, a less secure environment, more conducive to escapes. While Lucia took notes, visibly thoughtful, the villainess was already weaving other webs. In the prison yard during the brief period of sun, she approached an older inmate, a woman with tired eyes and faded tattoos, known as Old Clara. Clara was a respected or feared figure among the others. She knew the inner workings of that place like no one else. "Old Clara," the villainess began, her voice low and respectful, a tone she rarely used. "I'm new here, and I notice you have a wisdom I lack." Clara looked at her with suspicion, but the villainess continued undeterred. "I have resources out there, contacts, and I need information. Who comes and goes? Who talks to whom? Is there any guard who needs an extra incentive to turn a blind eye for a moment?" Clara smiled, a humorless smile. "Money doesn't buy everything in here, girl, but it buys a lot out there." The villainess nodded. "Exactly. And I have a lot out there I can offer, in exchange for discreet communication. A letter, a message, something that won't attract attention." She knew that corruption was a universal currency, and in prison, the promise of freedom or a better future for the guards' loved ones could be irresistible. The villainess did not expect an immediate answer. She had planted the seed. Now, it was a matter of time and observation. She continued to map the guards' routines, the cameras' blind spots, the creaking doors. Her mind, a labyrinth of cruelty and cunning, processed every detail, building a mental map of this new environment. The cell was small, but the world in her head was vast and full of dark possibilities. A few kilometers away, the morning sun caressed the elderly mother's aged face. She had slept, a deep, restorative sleep, the first in many years that had not been disturbed by fear or pain. Upon waking, she felt a lightness in her chest, as if an invisible weight had been removed. The nurse, the same one from the day before, entered with a gentle smile, bringing a cup of chamomile tea. "Good morning, madam. Did you sleep well?" The voice was a balm. The elderly woman nodded, a small smile curving her lips. Her throat still hurt, but a faint whisper managed to escape. "Yes, thank you." Each sip of tea was a small step on her healing journey. Each gentle touch, a reminder that kindness still existed. The social worker and Maria, the volunteer, returned, bringing not only flowers, but the promise of a future. "Madam, the nursing home has confirmed the vacancy," said the social worker, her voice full of hope. "It's a beautiful place in the countryside, with gardens and much peace." The elderly woman looked at Maria, who held her hand gently. The idea of a new beginning, away from her daughter's shadow, was almost unbelievable. The future, which once seemed a dark abyss, now opened with the promise of peace and security. She remembered the albino tiger, the unexpected guardian. Its image floated in her mind, a constant reminder that, even in the deepest darkness, light can emerge from where it is least expected. He had appeared, fulfilled his role, and retreated, leaving behind not only a legend, but a new chance at life for her. She couldn't speak much, but her eyes conveyed deep gratitude. A nod of her head, a squeeze of Maria's hand, and a small but sincere yes. It was the acceptance of a new chapter, the renunciation of a past of pain. At the police station, the prosecutor reviewed the case, satisfied with the solidity of the evidence. The denial of bail was a good omen. The neighbors' testimonies, the forensic evidence from the accident, the mother's medical report, and the villainess's own defiant attitude all pointed to a conviction. The story of the albino tiger, although it could not be used as direct evidence, had captured media attention, turning the case into a symbol of the fight against cruelty and abuse. The villainess was not just a criminal, she was the personification of evil, and the prosecutor was determined to ensure that justice was done. Meanwhile, in her cell, the villainess observed her evening meal, a bland stew. She had no appetite, but her mind was in constant motion. Attorney Lucia had promised to investigate the matter of the mother's delusions, a small but significant step in her plan. Old Clara, the older inmate, had given her a look of recognition in the yard, a sign that the message had been received. Her broken leg was an impediment, yes, but her mind, sharp and cruel, remained intact. Justice had reached her, yes, but the battle was far from over. In fact, for the villainess, it was just beginning. She would not be broken. She would rise again, and all those who dared to challenge her would pay. The game of chess had only just begun, and she, the fallen queen, was already planning her next move. The custody hearing had been only the first skirmish. The main trial was approaching, and with it, the opportunity to test the waters, to sow doubt, to begin to dismantle the web that bound her. Her lips curved into an almost imperceptible smile, a smile that did not reach her icy eyes. The world outside thought she was defeated. How foolish. She was merely regrouping, and the first phase of her escape and revenge plan was underway. The next step would be to contact Guard Silver. The next step was to contact Guard Silver. The villainess studied his routine, observing him from afar in the yard during shift changes on night rounds. He was a middle-aged man, with perpetual weariness etched on his face, his shoulders hunched under an invisible weight. His eyes, though attentive, carried a melancholy that the villainess recognized as vulnerability. He was the kind of man who dreamed of a better life, but was trapped in a cycle of obligations and debts. She waited for the right moment. One afternoon, during sunbathing, Silver was supervising the area near her cell, his attention divided between the radio on his belt and the scattered inmates. The villainess, sitting on a bench pretending to read a book, waited for him to pass by. "Guard Silver." Her voice was a whisper, but carried a subtle authority. He stopped, his tired eyes meeting hers. The villainess did not smile, showed no weakness. Just a direct, evaluative look. "Old Clara told me about you, about your family." Silver stiffened, his hand instinctively touching his gun holster. "I don't know what you're talking about, inmate." "Oh, yes you do," she replied, her voice still low but with a steel edge. "A sick wife, 3 children, debts piling up, and the gambling addiction, which only makes everything worse. It's not easy, I understand. Life out here is cruel, but in here, for those with family, it's even more so." He stared at her, a mixture of anger and fear in his eyes. No one there knew his problems in such detail. The villainess had touched an open wound. "I can help," she continued, her voice now almost seductive, a sweet poison. "I'm not asking for anything illegal, guard. Just discreet communication. A letter, a message, a small favor that wouldn't harm anyone, and in return, your daughter's medical school would be paid for, your wife's hospital bills cleared, a new life for your family, without you having to lift a finger or risk your job." Silver remained silent, his breathing heavy. The proposal was obscene, but the image of his daughter, with the sparkle in her eyes when talking about medicine, and his wife's pale face flooded his mind. The villainess noticed his hesitation, his internal conflict. "Think about it, guard," she finished, returning her attention to her book, as if the conversation had never happened. "The world out there is relentless, but I have resources, and I am grateful to those who help me." In the following days, the tension between them was palpable. Silva avoided her, but the villainess noticed his furtive glances, the way he seemed more thoughtful, more tormented. The seed had been planted. Meanwhile, attorney Lucia, the villainess's lawyer, followed her client's instructions with a mixture of skepticism and professional duty. She had requested an independent psychiatric evaluation for the elderly mother, and another for the villainess herself, citing stress and disorientation. The prosecutor, aware of the tactic, had already anticipated it, but Lucia's request opened a door for the theater the villainess wanted to stage. Lucia had also begun searching for the mother's diary in the old house. The place was sealed, but with a court order, she gained access. Hours of searching revealed only dusty boxes, old photos, and unimportant papers. No diary. The attorney felt a chill. Was the villainess really so manipulative, or was the mother in fact delusional? The doubt, small and insidious, began to corrode Lucia's certainty. A few kilometers away, at the nursing home in the countryside, the elderly mother flourished. The fresh air and the affection of Maria and the nurses were a balm. She could now converse for longer, her voice gaining strength each day. "I dreamed of him again," she confided to Maria, her eyes shining. "The tiger. He was looking at me, as if to say I was safe, that justice would be done." Maria just smiled, holding the elderly woman's wrinkled hand. That woman's faith was unshakable, and her recovery a miracle. At the police station, the prosecutor received the mother's psychiatric report. The report was categorical. The elderly woman was in full possession of her mental faculties, though traumatized. There were no signs of delusions or fantasies. Her testimony was consistent and reliable. The prosecutor felt relief and renewed determination. The defense's strategy to discredit the victim was crumbling before it even began. Back in prison, the villainess felt the pressure. Time was running out. She needed Silva. During the night round, when the corridor was deserted and the cameras seemed to have blind spots, Silva stopped in front of the villainess's cell. His eyes, once tired, now held a decision. "My daughter's tuition," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "and my wife's hospital bills, without me having to do anything that compromises me." The villainess smiled, a smile that did not reach her icy eyes. "Exactly, guard. Just discreet communication and information. Who comes and goes? Who talks to whom? Is there any guard who needs an extra incentive to turn a blind eye for a moment?" Silva nodded. A man who had just sold his soul, but who in his mind was saving his family. The villainess had gotten her pawn. The first phase of her escape and revenge plan was underway. The cell was small, but the world in her head was vast and full of dark possibilities. Justice had reached her, yes, but the battle was far from over. In fact, for the villainess, it was just beginning. She would not be broken. She would rise again, and all those who dared to challenge her would pay. The game of chess had only just begun, and she, the fallen queen, was already planning her next move. The villainess's cell now was more than a stage. It was a command center. With silver in her web, information began to flow, whispered in quick, furtive meetings. Disguised as routine rounds or brief moments in the yard, Silver, with the weight of the world and debts on his shoulders, had become a puppet. His eyes, once merely tired, now carried the guilt and fear of being discovered, but the image of his daughter in college and his wife recovering was a price he, in his desperate logic, was willing to pay. The villainess did not ask for obvious favors. Not immediately. Her cunning was more refined. She wanted the invisible map of the prison, the guards' routines, the cameras' blind spots, the times of greater and lesser vigilance, the personalities and vulnerabilities of other staff. She wanted to know who was corruptible, who was distracted, who had financial or family problems that could be exploited. Silver, with backstage access, was the perfect source. He reported on guard Souza, who constantly complained about his salary and had a son with health problems. On the head nurse, who was under pressure for a recent administrative error. Small, seemingly insignificant pieces that the villainess fitted into her complex escape puzzle. Meanwhile, outside the bars, the legal battle intensified. The prosecutor, in his office, felt the pressure of the media and the responsibility to ensure that the villainess paid for her crimes. He reviewed the mother's psychiatric reports, which confirmed her sanity and the coherence of her testimony. The defense's strategy to discredit the victim was, for the most part, neutralized, but he knew the villainess would not give up. Lucia's request for a psychiatric evaluation of the villainess herself was a tactic to create a narrative of stress or disorientation, perhaps to try for a reduced sentence. They will try to humanize her, or worse, paint her as a victim of some circumstance, the prosecutor instructed his team. Prepare for the staging. We need witnesses who can refute any claims of good behavior or remorse. The neighbors, the nursing home nurses who cared for the mother before, anyone who can attest to her pattern of cruelty. He knew the villainess was a born actress, capable of shedding false tears in court if it served her purposes. The image of the albino tiger, though not part of the legal process, hung over the case, a mystical reminder of the brutality that had been committed and the almost divine intervention that had stopped it. Attorney Lucia felt increasingly uncomfortable. The search for the mother's diary in the sealed house had been fruitless. She had scoured every corner, every box, and nothing. Not a scribble, not a mention. The villainess had insisted that the diary existed, that it was proof that the mother was delusional and unstable. The absence of the diary, combined with her client's calculating coldness, began to erode Lucia's faith in the villainess's innocence, or even her sanity. "Are you sure there isn't any other place your mother might have kept this diary?" Lucia asked during a prison visit, her voice laden with thinly veiled frustration. The villainess, seated in her makeshift wheelchair, her leg in a cast resting, merely smiled, a smile without warmth. "My mother was a woman of habit. If it wasn't there, perhaps she destroyed it. Or perhaps the police lost it. It wouldn't be the first time inconvenient evidence disappears." The insinuation was clear, and Lucia felt a chill. The villainess was weaving a web of lies so intricate that even she, the lawyer, began to feel entangled. The doubt, once a small seed, now sprouted, threatening the solidity of her defense. Far from there, in the nursing home, the elderly mother enjoyed a sunny day in the garden. The colorful flowers and the singing of birds were a balm for her soul. She held Maria's hand, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I feel so light, Maria," she said, her voice soft, "as if a huge weight has been lifted from me. I still see the tiger, you know, not as a dream, but as a presence. He gave me the strength to go on." The peace on her face, was a testament to the healing that was taking place, a stark contrast to the darkness that enveloped her daughter. Back in prison, Silver, under the villainess's instructions, began to act, small favors seemingly harmless. He bumped into guard Souza, dropping a note that looked like a loan advertisement but contained a phone number and a code. He forgot a supply closet door open for a few minutes, allowing the villainess to observe movement in an adjacent corridor. He lost a visitor request form, delaying the entry of a visitor the villainess didn't want there. The villainess, with her legs still immobilized, used the time to study every piece of information. She drew mental maps, schedules, flowcharts. Her mind was a fortress of planning. She knew that the escape would not be an impulsive act, but a meticulous orchestration. And Silver was just the first of her pawns. "Guard Silver," she whispered during another night round, when darkness and silence were her accomplices. "I need you to get a disposable cell phone, and I need you to contact guard Souza. Tell him that a friend can solve his problems, debts, his son's health, everything." Silver swallowed hard. A cell phone was a huge risk, but the villainess stared at him with an intensity that allowed no refusal. "What if I get caught?" he murmured, panic beginning to set in. "You won't," she replied, her voice cold and confident. "You're smart, and your family depends on it. Remember, guard, I'm not asking you to free me. Not yet. I'm asking you to help me prepare the ground, and every step you take, every risk you run, will be rewarded, generously." The villainess had become a parasite, sucking Silver's hope and morality, turning him into an extension of her own will. The cell, for her, was a cocoon, and she was preparing to emerge, not as a butterfly, but as a venomous spider, ready to weave a new web of destruction. The game of chess had advanced, and the fallen queen was about to move her most dangerous pieces. The next step would be to co-opt Souza, and with him, the villainess hoped to have a more concrete escape route. Justice, for her, was merely a temporary obstacle. The darkness of the night in prison was a cloak for the darkest deeds. Silver, with the villainess's request echoing in his mind, felt cold sweat run down his spine. A disposable cell phone. It was a leap into the abyss, a line crossed from which there would be no return. But the image of his daughter in college, of his wife in the hospital, was a hammer pounding in his conscience, forcing him to comply. He knew that the only way to get the device without raising suspicion was through one of the supply delivery men who had limited access to the administrative area. The next morning, with his heart pounding erratically, Silver approached one of the delivery men, a distracted young man who always wore headphones. "Hey kid, I need a favor," he said, his voice firmer than he felt. "My niece is sick, and I need a simple cell phone for her. Mine broke, and I can't afford a new one right now. Could you pick up one of those prepaid ones on your next delivery? I'll pay you double." The young man, seeing Silver's apparent distress and the promise of easy money, nodded without much thought. The villainess had chosen her pawn well. Silver was good at dissembling. 2 days later, the cell phone, small and discreet, was delivered to Silver, hidden in a trash bag he forgot to discard. The handoff was quick, almost imperceptible. The next challenge was to pass it to the villainess. He waited for the night round. When the corridor of the villainess's cell was quietest, with a rehearsed movement, he tripped near the door, dropping a book he used as a pretext for his rounds. As he bent down, the cell phone, wrapped in a dark piece of cloth, was skillfully slid through a crack in the cell door. A brief flicker of satisfaction in the villainess's eyes, an almost imperceptible nod. The first dangerous step had been taken. With the cell phone in hand, the villainess felt a renewed power. The cell, once a confinement, was now an operations center. She already had Souza's number, obtained through Silver and an old employee record. The message for Souza needed to be carefully crafted, not a threat, but an offer. a lifeline. That same night, Souza received a message from an unknown number. "Guard Souza, a friend heard about your problems. Sick son, debts. There is a solution, a way to ease your burden. Reply if interested." Souza read and reread the message, his heart heavy. Who could know his most intimate problems? Was it a trap, or was it in fact the chance he had been waiting for? Temptation was a sweet poison, and the image of his son coughing in bed was the needle that injected it. He hesitated, but despair was a cruel master. With trembling fingers he replied, "Who are you?" The villainess from the other side of the bars smiled. Souza had taken the bait. The reply came quickly. "A friend who can help you. Meet me tomorrow in the yard, near the fence, during your afternoon shift. Just observe. Say nothing. I will make the first move." Meanwhile, Lucia, the villainess's lawyer, felt increasingly uneasy. The absence of the mother's diary was a thorn in her side. The villainess insisted that the police had lost it, but Lucia, with her experience, knew it was a flimsy excuse. Her client's coldness, the way she spoke of her mother without a shred of remorse, disturbed her. During a visit, Lucia decided to be more direct. "My client," she began, her voice laden with a formality that did not hide her frustration. "The diary story is becoming a problem. Without it, your defense that your mother was delusional is much weaker, and your attitude, it's not helping." The villainess, seated in her wheelchair, her leg in a cast, merely stared at her with her icy eyes. "My attitude is that of an unjustly treated woman, Lucia, and if the diary isn't there, it's not my problem. Perhaps you're not looking in the right places, or perhaps you're not as committed as I thought." The insinuation was a low blow, and Lucia felt rage simmer. She was risking her reputation for that woman, and the villainess was manipulating her. The doubt about her client's innocence turned into a dark certainty. The villainess was guilty, and Lucia was being used. In the prosecutor's office, the team worked tirelessly. The prosecutor reviewed the testimonies, the forensic evidence, the reports. He knew the villainess would try everything to escape. "They'll try a plea bargain," he predicted to his team. "A reduced sentence for good behavior, or perhaps claim post-traumatic stress. Don't yield. Her cruelty was premeditated. Her mother almost died. There's no room for clemency." He had an ace up his sleeve, the testimony of Maria and the nursing home nurses, who would paint a vivid picture of the mother's suffering and the daughter's indifference. At the nursing home, the elderly mother was in the garden, watering the flowers. The peace on her face was palpable. She still felt the tiger's presence, not as a hallucination, but as a silent guardian. "He gave me strength, Maria," she whispered, caressing a rose. "The strength to forgive, but also to seek justice. He showed me that darkness cannot defeat light." Her recovery was a beacon of hope, a stark contrast to the web of intrigues her daughter wove in prison. The next day, in the prison yard, Souza, nervous, watched. He saw Silva, the guard who had given him the note, pass near the fence, making a discreet movement with his hand, as if adjusting his radio. It was a signal. Moments later, a note fell near his feet, as if carried by the wind. Souza waited, pretending to tie his shoelace, and picked it up. Inside, a phone number and the message, "Call. Your problems have a solution." Souza felt a chill. He was about to enter a world he didn't know, a world of shadows and compromises. But the image of his sick son was stronger than any fear. The villainess, from her cell, watched the yard through a small crack in the window, a cold smile on her lips. The game of chess advanced, and Souza, the new pawn, was about to make his first move. The fallen queen was assembling her army, piece by piece, and freedom, for her, was just a matter of time and manipulation. The night in prison was a heavy veil, but for guard Souza, it was a cloak of anguish. The crumpled note in his hand seemed to burn, the phone number a door to an abyss, or perhaps to salvation. The image of his son, pale and weak, coughing in bed, was a constant torment. He had tried everything, exhausted every resource, and now this anonymous voice offered a way out. Was it a trap? A test? The fear was real, but despair was a crueler master, and the promise of relief, a whisper too tempting to ignore. With trembling hands, Zuza dialed the number on a public phone in the administrative area, far from curious ears and cameras that monitored the main corridors. The voice on the other end was calm, serene, almost seductive. It was the villainess's voice. She didn't identify herself, but Souza recognized her, the calculating coldness, the sharp intelligence he had witnessed in the few times she had been brought in for questioning. "Guard Souza," she began, without preamble, as if reading his most intimate thoughts. "I know you're in a difficult situation. Your son needs treatment, and debts are piling up. I can help." Souza felt a cold shiver run down his spine. How did she know everything? His most intimate, most painful problems. "Who are you?" he managed to stammer, his voice choked, panic beginning to set in. "I am someone who understands despair," she replied, her voice maintaining an almost maternal tone, but with an undercurrent of steel, a veiled threat. "And someone with resources that can solve all your problems. In return, I only need your cooperation. Nothing that goes against your conscience at first. Just information, small favors, nothing you don't already do in your daily life, just with a different purpose." The villainess wove her web with mastery. She didn't ask for a leap into the dark, but small steps towards darkness, each one deeper than the last. She knew that the morale of a man broken by pain and debt was fertile ground for manipulation. She described in detail Souza's son's illness, the treatment costs, his family's financial situation, the overdue mortgage, the broken car. It wasn't an explicit threat, but a terrifying display of power, a reminder that she knew everything about him, about his weaknesses, about his loves. "I need details," she continued, her voice now firmer, more demanding. "Maps of security shifts, patrol routes, guard change times. I want to know about the security cameras, blind spots, alarm systems, and I need access to a computer that is not monitored. There is information I need to obtain, external contacts I need to make." Souza listened, his mind spinning in a whirlwind of fear and hope. Information. That wasn't the same as freeing a criminal, was it? He was just helping his son. The villainess felt his hesitation and struck again with the precision of a predator. "Think of your son, Souza. Think of the peace you will have when he is cured, when you can afford the best doctors, the best treatments. Think of your wife, free from worry, with a smile on her face. I can give you that. All I ask is that you help me help myself, and every piece of information, every small favor will be rewarded, generously, an amount that will change your family's life forever." The temptation was overwhelming. Despair, a poison that clouded judgment. Souza, with a heavy heart and a shattered soul, finally yielded. "What do I need to do?" he whispered, his voice almost inaudible, a murmur of surrender. The villainess smiled on the other end of the line, a silent and cruel victory. Pawn Souza was now firmly on her chessboard, ready to be moved. Meanwhile, Lucia, the attorney, was in her office, the desk covered with documents that once seemed mere papers, but now revealed a disturbing pattern. The conversation with the villainess had left her with a bitter taste and a dark certainty. The insinuation that she was not committed was an insult, but more than that, the certainty of the villainess's guilt had solidified. Lucia could no longer ignore the voice of her conscience, which cried out for justice. She began to review the case with a new perspective, no longer as the blind defense attorney, but as an investigator in search of the truth. the mother's diary. That was the crucial point, the missing piece. The villainess wanted it lost, but Lucia knew it existed. She remembered a minor detail in the initial police report, a box of the mother's personal belongings, collected from the crime scene. The diary could be there, waiting to be found. The next day, Lucia made a formal request to the prosecutor to access all items seized from the mother's residence. The prosecutor, aware of the villainess's cunning and her lawyers, was intrigued by his own attorney's request. "Why the sudden interest, Attorney Lucia?" he asked, suspicious, his eyes scrutinizing hers. Lucia, maintaining her composure and a firm voice, replied, "I believe there may be crucial evidence that has been overlooked, prosecutor. For my client's defense, it is vital that all documents be reviewed. We need to be sure that nothing has been omitted." The prosecutor, though skeptical and with a strange premonition, granted access, thinking that perhaps the attorney was just trying a new tactic, a desperate last resort. Little did he know that Lucia was, in fact, working for justice, not for the villainess. In prison, the villainess, now with Sousa under her control, intensified her demands. Silva, the guard who had delivered the cell phone, felt the weight of guilt and fear crushing him. He saw Sousa increasingly involved, the two whispering in hidden corners, exchanging papers and information. The villainess had created a network, and Silva was the first thread, now witnessing the corruption of another. He watched Sousa, a good man, slowly being corrupted, and saw a terrifying reflection of himself. Panic began to erode his determination, to erode his soul. He had crossed the line, and now there was no turning back. The villainess in her cell received Sousa's reports, detailed maps of shifts, camera blind spots, guard change times. She studied them with a maniacal intensity, tracing escape routes, calculating risks and opportunities. Her leg, still immobilized, was a hindrance, but her mind flew free, planning every move with surgical precision. She needed a plan that would compensate for her initial physical limitation, one that would use the prison's own structure against it. "Sousa," she sent a coded message, the tone imperative. "I need you to get an extra guard uniform and a master key, the one that opens supply closet doors and some isolation cells. Say it's for a routine security inspection, something that won't raise suspicion. And I need you to temporarily disable the camera in the East Corridor at 3 in the morning, next Tuesday. Just for 5 minutes, no more, no less." The request for the master key and the camera deactivation were a qualitative leap in danger. Sousa felt his stomach churn, a knot of dread forming in his throat. This was no longer just information. This was direct complicity in an escape, a serious crime. But the image of his son, the promise of money, was an invisible shackle that bound him, stronger than any cell. He knew he was going too far, that he was losing himself, but he couldn't stop. The villainess had become his only hope, and he was trapped in her web, a puppet in her hands. As the darkness of the prison deepened, the elderly mother at the nursing home watered her flowers. The peace in her heart was a balm, a gift from the white tiger that had awakened her to life. She felt that justice was approaching, not for revenge, but to restore balance, so that truth would prevail. The tiger for her was not just a memory, but a presence, a guardian spirit watching over her and those who sought the truth. The villainess's web stretched, but the light of hope and justice, guided by a silent guardian and an attorney in search of the truth, was about to tear it apart. The villainess's game of chess was in full swing, but she was about to discover that not all pieces bend to her will, and that the queen, however cunning, can be overthrown by an unexpected move. The darkness of the prison was a stage for Sousa's demons. Every step he took, every furtive glance he exchanged with the villainess, was another nail in his moral coffin. The image of his son, now more vivid than ever, was the fuel for his fall. The villainess's voice, a venomous whisper, had become the oracle of his life. He managed to get the extra uniform, inventing a plausible story about the need to replace a damaged item during a training exercise. The master key, however, was a much greater challenge. He needed days, observing, waiting, until an opportunity presented itself. During a shift change, in a moment of general distraction, he stole it from an older guard's keyring, who trusted him. The weight of the metal in his hand was the weight of his soul, now irremediably compromised. He felt a chill down his spine, a nausea that rose in his throat. There was no turning back. That Tuesday, the night in prison seemed denser, quieter. The air was charged with an invisible tension. At 3 a.m, Sousa was at his post in the east corridor, his heart beating like an uncontrolled drum. His fingers trembled as he manipulated the camera control panel. 5 minutes, no more, no less. The soft click of the system deactivating was a sound that echoed in his mind like thunder. The monitor in front of him flickered, showing a black screen instead of the corridor image. Sweat ran down his forehead, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He looked at the clock, the seconds dragging like hours. Every beat of his heart was a reminder of his betrayal. Meanwhile, in the isolation cell where she had been transferred under the pretext of an urgent medical evaluation, a favor Sousa had arranged, claiming a risk of contamination to other inmates due to her immobilized leg, the villainess was already in motion. She had dressed in the guard uniform, which, though a little loose, disguised her figure. Her immobilized leg was an obstacle, but she had rehearsed every movement, every maneuver to compensate for the limitation. The master key opened the cell door with a soft, almost inaudible click. The corridor was deserted, the darkness a complicit cloak. She moved with surprising speed, leaning on the walls, gliding like a shadow. Her destination, the supply area, a labyrinth of secondary corridors and storerooms, less monitored and with a rarely used service exit. The 5 minutes seemed an eternity for Sousa. He could feel the villainess's invisible eyes on him, the anticipation in every fiber of his being. When the time ran out, he reactivated the camera, the monitor coming back to life with the empty image of the corridor. A sigh of relief escaped his lips, but it was quickly replaced by a growing dread. He had done his part, but the villainess had promised it would be nothing against his conscience. A lie he had bought with his soul. The image of his son, once a beacon of hope, was now just a distant memory, obscured by the darkness of his own betrayal. Lucia, for her part, was immersed in her own search for the truth. In the police archive, the elderly mother's box of belongings lay before her. With protective gloves, she began to sift through the items, each one telling a silent story. Faded photos of a family that had once been happy, small objects of sentimental value, old letters. And then, at the bottom of the box, under a pile of lace handkerchiefs, she found it. A small brown leather-bound diary, worn by time and use. Lucia's heart pounded. It was it. The diary the villainess wanted lost. With trembling hands, Lucia opened the diary. The mother's handwriting was delicate, but the words were a cry of pain. The first pages described daily life, the small joys and sorrows, but as Lucia read on, the narrative transformed into an agonizing account of abuse, humiliation, and fear. Graphic details of the beatings, the threats, the daughter's cold cruelty. The mother had documented everything, with dates and disturbing descriptions. There were even mentions of a white tiger, a mystical figure the mother saw in her dreams, a silent guardian who promised justice. Lucia felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The proof was there, undeniable, irrefutable. It wasn't just the words, but the raw emotion, the palpable despair in every sentence. The villainess was not just guilty, she was a monster, and Lucia had been her lawyer, almost an accomplice to her farce. A wave of anger and determination washed over her. She knew what she had to do. The diary was the weapon she needed to expose the villainess and ensure that justice was done. She took photos of every page, ensuring the evidence was safe, even if the original were to be lost again. While the villainess moved stealthily through the prison corridors, her sharp mind calculating every step, Lucia was preparing her counter-offensive. The villainess's game of chess was in full swing, but she was about to discover that an unexpected piece had been moved, and that the queen, however cunning, could be overthrown by a truth that refused to be silenced. The villainess's meticulously constructed web was about to be torn apart, not by brute force, but by the relentless light of truth, revealed in the pages of a forgotten diary. At the nursing home, the elderly mother watered her flowers, a serene smile on her face. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves, and she felt a familiar presence, a comforting warmth, the white tiger. He was there, watching, and she knew with an unshakable certainty that balance was about to be restored. Justice for her was not revenge, but the promise of peace, an echo of that silent roar that had changed her destiny. The night in prison was a prelude to the dawn of a new truth. The villainess glided through the secondary corridors, the guard uniform, an imperfect but effective disguise in the dim light. Every step was a victory, every door opened with the master key, a silent cry of triumph. Her immobilized leg was a constant pain, a physical reminder of her initial defeat, but her mind already flew free, calculating the distance to the service exit. The smell of mold and disinfectant was the perfume of freedom. She reached the heavy, rusted metal door. A final click of the key, and the cold morning air greeted her. The deserted street, the complicit darkness. A car, discreetly parked a few blocks away, waited for her. An old contact, an expensive but necessary favor. Meanwhile, Sousa, at his post, felt the weight of the world collapse upon him. The camera monitor, now reactivated, showed an empty corridor, too empty. Cold panic consumed him. He had done his part, but the villainess had promised it would be nothing against his conscience. A lie he had bought with his soul. The image of his son, once a beacon of hope, was now just a distant memory, obscured by the darkness of his own betrayal. Sweat ran down his forehead, his eyes fixed on the screen, waiting for the inevitable. What would come next? The villainess had become his only hope, and he was trapped in her web, a puppet in her hands. But the strings were about to snap. Lucia, with the elderly mother's diary in hand, felt the fire of indignation burn in her chest. The words, the pain, the villainess's cold cruelty, it was all there, undeniable. She had been deceived, manipulated, almost an accomplice. But now the truth was exposed, and Lucia would not hesitate. She had taken photos of every page, ensuring the evidence was safe. The diary was the weapon she needed, not only to expose the villainess, but to ensure that justice was done. She called the police station, her voice firm, charged with a new determination. "I have the evidence," she said. "The evidence you need to arrest the villainess once and for all." The villainess limped hurriedly towards the car, adrenaline pulsing through her veins. The plan had been perfect. Escape, imminent. She opened the vehicle door, sat behind the wheel, and started the engine. The soft rumble was music to her ears. She put it in gear, her foot on the accelerator, ready to disappear into the night. Freedom was a touch away. She smiled, a cruel and victorious smile. No one would stop her now. But the villainess's meticulously constructed web was about to be torn apart by a force she could never have predicted. At the nursing home, the mother, watering her flowers, felt a gentle breeze, a familiar shiver. The white tiger. He was there, watching, and she knew with an unshakable certainty that balance was about to be restored. not for revenge, but for truth to prevail, for peace to finally reign. The silent roar that had changed her destiny was about to echo again. And then, it happened. At the exact moment the villainess accelerated the car, a majestic white blur emerged from the shadows, the albino tiger. It was not an illusion, not a dream. It was real, imposing, its blue eyes gleaming with a supernatural intensity. It leaped with astonishing agility, landing on the car's hood with a brutal impact. Sharp claws tore through the metal, the animal's muscular body denting the bodywork. The villainess screamed, a sound of pure terror. The shock, the unexpected weight, the terrifying sight of the tiger right in front of her, all made her lose control. The car swerved violently, tires screeching on the asphalt. She tried to brake, tried to turn the wheel, but it was too late. The runaway vehicle collided with the prison's concrete wall with devastating force. The sound of the impact echoed in the night, a metallic scream of pain and destruction. Pain exploded in the villainess's leg, a dry snap, followed by a searing pang that made her faint for an instant. When consciousness returned, she was trapped in the twisted wreckage of the car, her leg broken again, this time much more severely. The tiger, after the impact, descended from the car with the same grace with which it had appeared, its eyes fixed on her for a moment before turning and disappearing into the darkness, as mysteriously as it had arrived. The noise of the accident alerted the guards. Within minutes, the area was surrounded. Souza, hearing the crash, ran to his post window. The scene before him was the end of his nightmare and the beginning of his punishment. The destroyed car, the villainess being pulled from the wreckage, groaning in pain, her leg at an unnatural angle. He knew he had been discovered, that the villainess's web had unraveled, taking him with it. The image of his son now was just a distant memory, obscured by the darkness of his own betrayal. The villainess was rushed to the prison infirmary, her broken leg requiring immediate surgery. This time, there would be no subterfuge. Lucia, with the diary in hand, presented the irrefutable evidence. The photos, the dates, the graphic details of the abuse. The attorney not only ensured that the villainess was tried for the crimes against her mother, but also that her escape attempt was added to the list of charges. Souza, under interrogation, confessed everything, guilt and fear, finally freeing him from the villainess's web. He would face the consequences of his actions, but somehow he felt a bitter relief. The villainess, with her leg in a cast and her mind in tatters, was sentenced to a long prison term without possibility of bail or parole. Justice, slow and relentless, had finally prevailed. The elderly mother, at the nursing home, continued to water her flowers, a serene smile on her face. The white tiger for her was not just a memory, but a constant presence, a guardian spirit that had restored balance, that had brought peace. The silent roar of justice had echoed, and the villainess's web, however cunning, had been torn apart by truth, by light, and by the unexpected intervention of a wild guardian. The game of chess had come to an end, and the queen, however cruel, had been overthrown by an unexpected move, a move of pure and indomitable justice.